Hello class, Professor Mandeville back as promised. Hope you're all surviving this heat wave. I'm in the air-conditioned splendor of the Champlain Memorial Library. I figured it's a good day to do that instead of sitting, sweat to death at home. So, what I want to talk to you about next is the amazing life of Benjamin Franklin. He was really the age of reason all wrapped up in one person. So, Benjamin Franklin was born in Boston on January 17th, 1706. He was the 15th child of 17 children born to his mother and father. During the colonial days, families were very, very large. In fact, the average woman in the 1700s gave birth to 9 children, believe it or not. That was the average. So, Benjamin Franklin's mom and dad had way more than the average, but that wasn't uncommon. So, later on, though, when Benjamin Franklin marries his wife, Deborah, in 1730, they're going to have a reasonably sized modern-style family. They'll have 3 children. I suppose maybe Ben had his fill of being part of a very large family as a young man. So, Benjamin Franklin's life will change dramatically when he leaves Boston to join one of his older brothers in Philadelphia as a young man to learn the printing trade. His brother owned a print shop, so Benjamin Franklin left Boston, moved to Philadelphia at a young age, and became a printer's apprentice under his brother. It is one of his older brothers, so when you have 16 brothers and sisters, some of them can be old enough, to where they're almost like second parents to you. So, in Philadelphia, that's where Benjamin Franklin will learn his main profession, which is being a printer, publisher, and author. And after he learns this trade, he'll venture out on his own, and he will, in 1729, start publishing the largest newspaper in Philadelphia, the Pennsylvania Gazette. And publishing that newspaper from 1729 to 1766, and publishing other items and just having a print shop is how Benjamin Franklin fed his family. That was the bread and butter for them. That was his main source of income. Now, Franklin will venture into being an author in 1733 when he'll publish his first edition of Poor Richard's Almanac, which he obviously publishes on an annual basis. It's kind of similar to the Farmer's Almanac, except it has a lot of, wise quotes and ways to model and live your life. Some things that have come out of, Poor Richard's Almanac's quotes that you're probably familiar with. Early to bed, early to rise, makes a man healthy, wealthy, and wise. A penny saved is a penny earned. When you run into debt, you give another power over your liberty. And so on and so forth. There's many, many of these little quips that Ben Franklin embedded in Poor Richard's Almanac, which he published between 1733 and 1758. So, he was an accomplished printer, publisher, and author. Another thing that he published is something that I lectured about earlier, That's the Albany Plan. Remember, he was the chair of the Albany Congress, called forth by William Pitt to organize the colonies for the French and Indian War. And after they came up with the document, the Albany Plan, Franklin took it back to Philadelphia to his print shop, and he's the one who printed up the copies for everyone. Now, on top of that, Benjamin Franklin was a scientist slash inventor. And most of you are probably aware of his experiments concerning electricity. And you probably learned as kids how Benjamin Franklin went out and flew a kite in a lightning storm with a key on the end because he was fascinated by the unharnessed power of lightning and electricity. So, out of these experiments, one of the biggest inventions that is monumental, and he doesn't get much credit for it, is Benjamin Franklin will invent the lightning rod. The lightning rod saved tens of thousands of buildings from destruction. A lightning rod, and you still see them in use on some old buildings, especially old barns. You'll see them along the peak of the roof, a lot of times with the glass ball in them, and they're made of copper. What they're designed to do, as Ben Franklin invented them, is to attract the strike of lightning on the tallest building in the area and then direct it harmlessly into the ground, because connected to the lightning rod would be copper wire down into a grounding device embedded in the ground. If before there were lightning rods used, if lightning hit your barn or your home or whatever, in some cases it would literally explode and certainly burst into flames. You've probably all seen trees that have been hit by lightning, and in some cases they look like they literally blew up. So, Franklin saved a lot of buildings with that innovative invention. Today, since we do have electricity in our homes, all of your homes are grounded. So if lightning hits them, it typically will go through the electrical system, and then your electrical system is grounded just like a lightning rod would be. So, other things that Benjamin Franklin invented. In many cases, he was a very practical inventor, as I like to call him. He's just tinkering around with things that he uses on a regular basis, trying to refine them, make them better. Benjamin Franklin came up with several modifications to the printing press that had been invented centuries before and made it faster and more efficient, and a lot of other printers adopted his innovations. He also, talking of practical inventions, Benjamin Franklin, like myself, was both far-sighted and nearsighted. And that meant back in that day and age, he had to have two pairs of glasses. He had a pair of glasses just to see under normal circumstances. Then he had a pair of reading glasses to, be able to see close up. He got sick and tired of losing one pair of glasses, which he commonly did. So what he did was take his two pairs of glasses, cut the lenses in half, and put them in the same frame, creating the first ever bifocal lens. Now, obviously, I wear bifocals right here. Mine are the lineless or whatever, but the first bifocals were invented by Benjamin Franklin. Another thing that he invented that changed a lot of people's lives was Franklin got sick and tired of trying to heat his home in Philadelphia with a series of fireplaces. As you may know, if you've ever tried to keep your home warm, if you've got even one fireplace, or maybe if you've got more than one, it's not a very efficient way of heating. a lot of that heat goes right up the chimney. So Benjamin Franklin invented what it amounted to the first wood stove, the Franklin stove, made of heavy iron, which you'd have the fire inside, obviously. You're all familiar with them. Then that heavy iron stove held a lot of that heat and radiated it out into the home instead of most of it going up the chimney in a fireplace. So those are some of Franklin's practical inventions. Benjamin Franklin was also a social reformer. And the benefactor of these social reforms was his adopted hometown of Philadelphia. Now, the things that Benjamin Franklin will, reforms that he'll usher in for the citizens of Philadelphia include the first full-time fire department in colonial America. Benjamin Franklin was very concerned about homes burning, obviously. He invented the lightning rod, and he believed that they needed a full-time fire department to be able to react to fires at a moment's notice in the city of Philadelphia. He also founded the first public hospital in the colonies for the public to be able to access medical care anytime they saw fit. He also created the first postal system. It was just for the city of Philadelphia, but later our nationwide postal system under the Washington administration will be modeled after Franklin's Philadelphia system. He will also be one of the founders of a great university, the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia, a very prominent Ivy League institution today. That's why if you ever visit Penn, as it's known, there are numerous statues of Benjamin Franklin on that campus. And Benjamin Franklin, speaking of where I'm seated today, organized the first public library in the colonies in Philadelphia. So, as you can see, Benjamin Franklin was quite a social reformer, and initially Philadelphia was the benefactor of these great breakthroughs, but then later on many of them were modeled throughout the colonies. Now, another area where Benjamin Franklin was quite accomplished was in the area of politics and diplomacy. Benjamin Franklin was a master politician and also one of our greatest ever diplomats. Now, Franklin got his first real taste for politics when he became a clerk in the Pennsylvania Assembly, the governing body of the colony. Then his first major assignment was he was sent to London as an observer in Parliament for the colony of Pennsylvania. All the colonies had observers in Parliament who would be there to observe what was going on, obviously, as far as laws being passed. And, you know, soon you'll be watching a lecture where I'll be talking about all sorts of laws that the colonists hated, the series of taxes that led us right to the Revolution, like the Sugar Act, Stamp Act, Townsend Revenue Acts, and so forth. So the colonies would have observers there to observe that, and then if members of the British Parliament decided to, they could call upon them to share any sort of input they might have. So, for example, back when Parliament actually cared what the colonists thought, they might call on Franklin to say, you know, we're about ready to pass this proposed piece of legislation. What do you think people in Pennsylvania and Philadelphia will think about it? And then Franklin could offer his 2 cents worth. They could listen to him, take it under consideration or just say thanks a lot, we really don't care. But obviously Franklin and the other observers did not have any voting power in Parliament, which is part of the problems with the rallying cry of the revolution, taxation without representation. So, Benjamin Franklin, there'll be one particular act that's passed by Parliament in the 1700s that he detests more than anything when he had his involvement with the British political system. And that's an act known as the Transportation Act. Now, the Transportation Act was an act that was passed by Parliament to take care of a problem that they were experiencing in England. England had done away with capital punishment, so they stopped executing people. And slowly but surely, this caused their prisons to start to be overcrowded with people that in the past they would have executed. Now they're going to give them life sentences. So in order to solve this problem of prison overcrowding, Parliament passes the Transportation Act, which sends dangerous felons to the colonies who they're going to release from prison as indentured servants. Now, I'm sure you're all familiar with what an indentured servant was. It was talked about in your textbook. But to refresh your memory, an indentured servant is sort of like a temporary slave. If you're a poor peasant in England and you'd like to come to the colonies to start a new life, you could sign a contract where a farm owner over here in the colonies would pay for your passage or your ship ride to the colonies, and in exchange you'd have to work for that farmer for between 5 and 7 years. You wouldn't receive any pay. What pay you were supposedly earning went to pay off your debt for your ship's passage, and you were only supplied with room and board, clothing, and so forth. It was sort of a form of temporary slavery. You were basically the person that paid your ship ride over's slave for 5 to 7 years. But then once the contract was fulfilled, you were free to go, and you could go off then and work as a tenant farmer, save your money, and buy your own land. So they're mixing in with these indentured servants who companies would arrange these contracts over in London, these released dangerous felons. And you never knew whether or not the indentured servant you just entered into a contract was a peasant or a dangerous felon. And it wasn't just a handful that were sent over here. This law lasted from early in the 1700s all the way to 1775, and it's estimated that 5,000 to 50,000 of these felons were sent here. Nobody knows for sure because they didn't really keep the detailed records for obvious reasons. So, Benjamin Franklin detested this law. He argued that it made the colonies a dumping ground for unwanted felons in England proper, and it just goes to show what they think of us colonists, mixing these very dangerous people unknowingly among us. And so Benjamin Franklin started a petition drive in the colonies and got thousands of signatures, which he then personally delivered to Parliament and presented it to them when he was still an observer. Parliament basically said thanks, didn't pay any attention to it, and just went on with business. Because of that, Benjamin Franklin resigned as an observer to Parliament. He was fed up. After he returned back to Philadelphia, he did something that has become quite famous. He sent Parliament another box. Previously, he had delivered a box of petitions. This time, he mails them what they think is another box of petitions. But actually, what was inside the box was a couple of rattlesnakes that Franklin had captured with a note that said, "Now you know how we feel. Quit sending us your rattlesnakes." A great symbolic gesture, obviously, but Parliament just could care less, and Franklin had resigned, and they say, that crazy Ben Franklin. Now, as far as Franklin's, the rest of his political and diplomatic career, as we know, and as you'll find out, you already know about the Albany Congress, but that's just the beginning for Franklin. Franklin's going to be at every important meeting that takes place in the colonies and early America, including the Albany Congress. Then, when we get into the Revolution here soon, and you start studying that, it's all open now in Module 4. Benjamin Franklin was at the Stamp Act Congress when it took place. Benjamin Franklin was at the very first Continental Congress. Benjamin Franklin was at the second. He was at the part of the Continental Congress in 1776 and helped Thomas Jefferson author the Declaration of Independence, passed in July of 76. So, and then later on, as far as important meetings in American history, Benjamin Franklin's last great meeting that he attends will be the Constitutional Convention held in 1787 in his hometown of Philadelphia. And by that point in his life, he's into his 80s, and he's sort of the walking history book sage of the whole meeting. George Washington presided over the Constitutional Convention, but Franklin was like the source. Whenever you had a question of how do we do it in the past or what happened when we did this, who are they going to call on? The old wise sage, Benjamin Franklin. Now, Benjamin Franklin was also instrumental in helping America win the American Revolution. Not as a soldier, obviously he was too old by then, but as a diplomat. During the Revolution, Benjamin Franklin was our ambassador to France. And he had been constantly meeting with the King of France, trying to convince them to back the rebels in the revolution. Putting forth the idea that the enemy of your enemy is your ally. And remember, France and England had fought, all those wars right up to the French and Indian War, and there's no love lost between France and England. They're still mortal enemies. But what's going to be the big turning point, as you'll find out in future lectures here and what you read in the book, after the decisive victory at Saratoga, that's the turning point of the war. And that will, once Franklin can tell the French about the great victory at Saratoga, where Burgoyne and his thousands of soldiers had to lay down their weapons and surrender, that's what finally convinced the French to first back us by buying millions of dollars worth of Revolutionary War bonds right when we needed them because we were broke. Then by the end of the war, sending French troops and the French Navy to fight side by side with George Washington, and they were very important at the decisive victory that ended the war at Yorktown. That was all thanks to Benjamin Franklin. Now, Benjamin Franklin, before he was the ambassador to France, was famous throughout Europe. From his times as a parliamentary advisor, he also used to travel Europe, especially France, giving lectures on basically his thoughts on life, politics, and so forth. So before he was even the ambassador, to France, he was known throughout much of Europe as, quote unquote, the great American philosopher. Now, Benjamin Franklin lived a very long life. Part of the reason why he lived so long is he was an avid swimmer. Benjamin Franklin, unlike a lot of colonists, dismissed the idea, there's still a lot of superstition and myth, and medicine's in its fledgling stages. A lot of colonists believe that if you got wet, that's what caused you to catch a cold, and then ultimately could cause you to develop pneumonia and it'd kill you. Benjamin Franklin, that I already mentioned, was instrumental in organizing the first public hospital. Believed that was a bunch of nonsense. And he was an avid swimmer. And during good, summertime weather in the fall and whatnot, he would swim every day religiously throughout his entire life, dismissing this notion that if you got wet, you're going to catch a cold, get pneumonia, and die. Now, Franklin, unlike most colonists, you probably heard about the saying that Saturday was bath day. That was the truth in the colonies. Colonists would typically bathe once a week, and then you'd sort of have to force them because they're so afraid of pneumonia. Benjamin Franklin swam every day, so he had much better personal hygiene. Maybe that's why he lived to be 84 years old, which was way beyond the typical life expectancy of an average colonist in the 1700s, which was about 51 years old. Now, one thing that I want to end up our talk about Franklin is something that there are numerous biographies on Benjamin Franklin. I encourage you to read one or two of them. He's a really interesting person. But if you do read some of these biographies, you're going to be exposed to the idea that Benjamin Franklin was also, I suppose, what you would call a ladies' man. And when he traveled to Europe on his speaking tours and when he was ambassador, he never brought his family with him. His wife Deborah and his children would remain behind in the colonies and, take care of the print shop and whatnot. So, Benjamin Franklin was very charismatic, and women adored him. And Franklin traveled a lot in Europe, traveled around the United States as a politician and so forth. And it's estimated that Benjamin Franklin, in all likelihood, fathered more than 70 children out of wedlock. Now, only reason I'm mentioning this is because you're no doubt, if you get interested in Franklin and read a lot about him, you're going to read this. And I don't want you to get the impression what a scumbag Franklin was, playing around on his wife like that. It kind of went with the territory, and I've never really read, and Deborah Franklin never left behind a journal, whether or not they had some sort of agreement, an open marriage or whatnot. I don't really know. Quite frankly, I don't care. That's their business. And as many of you know, major figures like Benjamin Franklin and a lot of American presidents and other major politicians end up being pretty charismatic and have, in social norms, less than desirable private life. Franklin Roosevelt had a mistress. John F. Kennedy had several. Bill Clinton did. But the one thing we need to do is we can't mix that with what they did for America in general. If we were going to dismiss the great works of Franklin Roosevelt, Kennedy, and even President Clinton, who did a lot for this country, to me, that would be unfair. It'd be just as unfair as saying, well, Ben Franklin was really great, but played around on his wife, so he's worthless. So, I wanted to expose you to that because you're going to read about it if you get interested in them, but by no means am I emphasizing it. But it does lead me to one of my favorite historical puns. Now we know why Ben Franklin was one of the original founding fathers. I know, that was a bad one. So, I'm going to call her quits for today. That's the great American Benjamin Franklin. And I'll probably do another couple of supplementary lectures if I get time to, but with all the other ones that I posted in Module 4, you're going to be pretty well prepared to take the midterm exam here next week. So get to work in those discussions, start watching my video lectures, and I'll be talking to you soon. Everybody take care, stay cool, be safe. Bye now.